On the evening of the 11th of December, 1936, at a rented villa outside Cannes called Louviers, a 40-year-old American woman sat down in front of a radio and listened to the most powerful man in her life give away an empire. 600 miles north, from a room at Windsor Castle, Edward VIII told the nation, and an empire spanning every time zone, that he had found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge his duties as king, as he would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman he loved. BBC Director General John Reith had introduced him not as the king, but as His Royal Highness Prince Edward. He was no longer the king. He had reigned for 325 days without ever being crowned. The world heard a romance. Wallis Simpson heard a door closing. She recorded what happened in her own memoirs. She lay on the sofa with her hands over her eyes, trying to hide her tears. When the broadcast ended, the others at Louviers quietly left the room. She lay there a long time before she could compose herself to go upstairs. That account, which she wrote herself, isn't triumph. It isn't vindication. It's a woman face down on a borrowed sofa in somebody else's country, unable to stand up. In the weeks before that broadcast, she had been writing to the husband she had just divorced, Ernest Simpson, letters that read less like the correspondence of a triumphant schemer and more like messages from a woman begging to be let out of a room. She had offered to leave. She had offered to disappear. She had offered, in her own words, to quietly slip away. And the man who gave up his throne had answered, according to multiple biographical sources, that if she left him, he wouldn't survive it, and she would be blamed for that too. A note on evidence. Where the record contains documented fact, this script states it as fact. Where it contains only allegation, contested interpretation, or reported recollection, it will be named as such. The documentary record on Wallis Simpson contains both categories, and conflating them is how the myth survived 90 years. The two questions this story answers are simple. Did she want him? And did she have a choice? The answers aren't what you have been told. She was born Bessie Wallace Warfield on the 19th of June, 1896, at a resort in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania, though Baltimore is where she was raised and where her story begins in any meaningful sense. Her father, Teakle Wallace Warfield, had taken Alice Montague there hoping for his health. Tuberculosis does not negotiate. He died in Baltimore on the 15th of November, 1896, when Wallis was 5 months old. The family, Alice and her infant daughter, moved into the Warfield home on East Preston Street under the care of bachelor Uncle Solomon Davies Warfield. Solomon was a prominent man, former postmaster of Baltimore, eventually president of Continental Trust Company and the Seaboard Air Line Railway. He paid for things. He paid irregularly. Anne Seba, whose 2011 biography, That Woman, remains the most rigorous modern account of Wallis's life, characterizes the lesson this delivered as precise and double-edged. You have to rely on a man, but you can't trust that he will be there. The allowances from Solomon arrived in inconsistent quantities, sometimes generous, sometimes nothing at all. Seba describes it as cruelly controlling. Solomon paid for Wallis's education at Oldfield School in Maryland, the most expensive and fashionable girls' preparatory school in the state, and Wallis was acutely aware of attending it on another person's money, surrounded by DuPont daughters in dresses that didn't need to be copied from magazine photographs. She dropped the name Bessie as soon as she could choose. She said it sounded like a cow. She chose Wallis, her father's name, and held it for the rest of her life. What her childhood gave her wasn't money. It was proximity to people who had it. and the social fluency to move among them as if she belonged. That skill, the capacity to make powerful people feel understood, would define every important relationship of her adult life. When she was 19, denied a coming-out ball by Solomon on grounds of wartime impropriety, she married the first available escape. It took 11 years and 2 continents to undo. On the 8th of November 1916, Wallis married Earl Winfield Spencer, Jr. in Baltimore. He was a U.S. Navy aviator, 26 years old, from a respectable Chicago family, the kind of man she had been told to find. The marriage collapsed almost immediately under his alcoholism and violence. His own naval service records noted a temper that cost him the promotions he craved. His superiors cited his volatility as a reason not to advance him. Both of his subsequent wives, after Wallis divorced him, cited the same drinking and violence. He was consistent. She accompanied him to postings including China around 1924 and 1925, spending extended time in Peking and Shanghai, in relative independence. When she returned to Baltimore and approached Solomon about funding a divorce, he told her that no warfield had ever divorced, that she would bring shame on the family, and that the inheritance she stood to receive would be redirected to establishing a home for aged and indigent gentlewomen in Baltimore. He named it specifically, so she would know what her disobedience cost. She divorced Spencer anyway. The decree became final in 1927. Divorced women in 1920s American upper-class society faced real social penalties, and Wallis understood them. She paid them. That capacity, to see the cost of leaving a destructive man clearly and leave anyway, is the context in which her inability to leave Edward later becomes significant, not as a contradiction of her character, but as evidence of what had changed. She had done it before, against harder obstacles. By the time she was trapped in 1936, something different was happening. She met Ernest Aldrich Simpson through her school friend Mary Kirk around 1926. Ernest was born in New York City in 1897, American by birth, British by inclination, and eventually by formal naturalization. His father was a British shipbroker, one of the founders of Simpson, Spence and Young. Ernest had attended the Hill School in Pennsylvania and Harvard, served as an officer in the Coldstream Guards during the First World War, and joined the family firm in London afterward. He was tall, fair-haired, with a careful blonde mustache. Andrew Morton's 2018 biography describes him as reliable, cultured, and not particularly dramatic, courteous, quiet, genuinely kind. They married on the 21st of July, 1928, at a register office in Chelsea, with their address listed as 12 Upper Berkeley Street. By 1931, they were comfortably established in London with a full household staff, holding dinner parties for fashionable company, moving in circles that included Thelma Furness, the established American mistress of the Prince of Wales. Ernest had enjoyed the proximity to royalty. It interested him, and the professional and social doors it opened were useful to his work. Some of those who knew them at the time suggested as much. There is reasonable supporting evidence in the contemporaneous social record for the view that both Simpsons treated the royal connection as professionally advantageous. Seba herself concluded that in those early years, Wallis had wanted an adventure before she turned 40, something to reassure herself she was still attractive, and to give the Simpsons a lift in London society. That isn't a scheming huntress. That is a woman in her late 30s treating the Prince of Wales as the world's most prestigious social acquaintance. What happened next, in Seba's phrase, was that it got out of hand as Edward became madly obsessed with Wallis, at any cost. Ernest, who had initially enjoyed the access almost as much as his wife, had had more than enough of it by 1935. By 1936, so had she. The question the letters answer, the ones sealed in their envelopes until 2011, is whether Ernest was ever, in any real sense, replaced in Wallis's affections. The letters are clear on this point in ways that nothing published before Seba's discovery was able to show. Thelma Furness, Viscountess Furness, American socialite, identical twin of Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, had been the Prince of Wales's mistress from approximately 1929. In early 1934, she sailed for America. Before departing, according to her own account in her 1958 memoir Double Exposure, she asked Wallis to look after the Prince of Wales in her absence. This account exists in one published source, Thelma's own memoir. Double Exposure was written 24 years after the events it describes, with considerable reputational stakes. Multiple biographers have flagged the self-serving character of this account. The look after him instruction appears nowhere else in the contemporaneous record, and the framing conveniently transfers agency from Thelma to Wallis at the exact point where Thelma lost control of the situation. Thelma's account, in other words, is the only version of the handoff in which Thelma bears no responsibility for what followed. What is documented is what happened during Thelma's American trip. She entered into a relationship with Ali Khan. Multiple biographers confirm this. Edward, learning of the infidelity, transferred his emotional focus to Wallis. By the time Thelma returned from America, it was finished. Historian Hugo Vickers, whose research on the Windsor Papers is among the most detailed in the field, concluded that Wallis enjoyed being the king's friend, but in no way wanted to become his wife or to cause a major constitutional crisis. That assessment corresponds precisely with what the documentary record shows. His fixation developed with particular intensity because she wasn't pursuing him. She was performing a social obligation, charming a man she'd been asked to entertain, treating him as important rather than as a target. The pursuit intensified in response to what he experienced as genuine indifference to his position. He wasn't accustomed to it. She had no idea what she had set in motion. Fort Belvedere is a neo-Gothic country house in Windsor Great Park, given to Edward for his use from 1930 onward. He added a swimming pool and tennis court, worked in the gardens with persistent attention, and used the house to host a private circle well outside the conventional aristocracy. By early 1935, 2 rooms at Fort Belvedere had been combined specifically for Wallis's use. That physical fact, the rooms merged, the space made permanent, tracks the escalation more precisely than any declaration of intent. British intelligence services were tapping the King's telephone. Documents released years later confirmed that the Home Secretary, Sir John Simon, had authorized the interception. So concerned was he by the King's relationship with an American divorcee. The content of the recorded conversations hasn't been published in full. What the surveillance confirms is that official concern had reached the level of active monitoring. Multiple biographers, drawing on contemporaries' recollections, describe a pattern during this period. Edward calling repeatedly, growing distressed or angry when Wallis tried to create distance, making emotional demands that made withdrawal feel impossible. Philip Ziegler's official biography characterizes Edward as emotionally immature, obsessive, and deeply dependent on Wallis. Historian Tracy Borman described his affection as clingy and cloying, and concluded that Wallis felt suffocated by the marriage and his obsessive love. These assessments rest on witness recollection and biographical reconstruction, rather than verbatim transcripts, and are presented here as such. The jewelry he gave her is documented in auction records and is specific. A Van Cleef and Arpels ruby bracelet in 1936, engraved, "Hold Tight," given during the most uncertain period of their relationship, when Wallis was still in the process of divorcing Ernest and the future of Edward's reign was unresolved. A Cartier cross charm bracelet built across 10 years beginning in 1934, 9 platinum and gem-set crosses, each engraved with significant dates. An engagement ring, a 19.77-carat rectangular emerald engraved on the interior, "We are ours now, 26 by 36. At the Sotheby's auction in Geneva in 1987, a year after Wallis's death, 214 pieces from her collection, 87 of them Cartier, were estimated at $7.5 million and sold for well over $50 million. The collection was the most expensive private jewelry sale in history at that point. The auction record is material proof of the scale of his pursuit. It says nothing about whether the pursuit was welcome. George V died on the 20th of January 1936. Edward's accession transformed the problem entirely. A personal obsession, contained until then within the social world of Fort Belvedere weekends, became a matter for the Cabinet, the Church of England, and the Dominion Prime Ministers. A private man's fixation had acquired constitutional force. Wallis's ability to exit quietly, the exit that still existed while she was merely the wife of a shipping executive who happened to know the Prince of Wales, evaporated on the day he took the crown he wouldn't keep. The decree nisi was granted on the 27th of October 1936 at the Suffolk Assizes in Ipswich. The presiding judge was Mr. Justice Hawke. Wallis's counsel was Norman Burkitt, one of the most eminent barristers of the period. The grounds were Ernest Simpson's adultery with a woman at the Hôtel de Paris, Bray, on the 21st of July 1936. The choice of Ipswich was deliberate. Wallis had established temporary residence at Beach House, Felixstowe, specifically so the case could be heard at a nearby provincial court and clear the metropolitan press. American journalists, operating under no gentleman's agreement to suppress the story, had been writing about the royal romance for months. The British press was holding barely. The proceedings were brisk. The contemporaneous verbatim record reads, Burkitt, upon that evidence I ask your lordship for a decree nisi. Justice Hawke, I suppose I must find adultery in this case. The adultery was staged. Ernest had cooperated with the legal fiction because Wallis needed a defendant, and the divorce law of the period required one. Ernest later wrote to his mother that such arrangements were simply how things were done, especially where members of the royal family were concerned, since the king couldn't be named in court. His cooperation is read differently by different biographers, as dignified resignation, as an act of love for a woman he was losing, as a practical arrangement whose emotional weight he bore with characteristic quiet. He was, Seba noted, not without a sense of humor. Writing to his mother 4 days after the abdication, he reminded her that she really should be more careful about which daughters-in-law she approved, since, after all, we haven't got kings to hand out left and right. Under English divorce law at the time, a decree nisi was provisional. It couldn't become absolute for a minimum of 6 months. The decree absolute wasn't granted until the 3rd of May 1937. That window matters because from the moment Wallis received the nisi, the legal calendar was counting down toward her freedom to remarry, regardless of what she wanted in the intervening months. The timetable closed her options, not by Edward's sole design. The law created it. But the result was the same. She was legally committed to a process whose endpoint served his purposes, whether she wished it to or not. She wrote to Ernest from Felixstowe 2 days before the hearing. The letter was postmarked October 1936 and had been sealed in its original envelope since the day she sent it. When Seba opened it in 2011, it read, I am terrified of the court. I feel small and licked by it all. I can't think of what sort of mess I'm leaving for. I'm sorry for myself. I'm sorry for the king. I hate stuffy British minds and, last but not least, I don't understand myself, which is the cause of all the misery. Give me courage. I'm so lonely. The letter was timed 2:15 Tuesday and signed Love Wallis. That isn't what a triumphant schemer writes. It's what a frightened woman writes to the one person she trusts enough to ask for courage, 2 days before she formally destroys his reputation in open court. In 2011, Anne Seba was at the end of her source list. One last interview to tick off, a routine visit to someone who had insisted they had nothing to tell her. After a polite chat, she wrote in the Sunday Telegraph, My host went out and brought back a packet of blue letters, tied up with ribbons, saying, "You might find these interesting." The letters were still in their original envelopes. The postmarks were 1936 and 1937. Seba began transcribing on the spot. She described holding them as holding dynamite. 15 letters, written by Wallis Simpson to Ernest Simpson, the man she was publicly divorcing, the man she was supposed to hate. Preserved through the Raffray family archive, Ernest had later married Mary Kirk, Wallis's childhood friend from Baltimore, and their son, who had never known Wallis, to whom her name was almost entirely absent from his father's household, and who found the entire story abhorrent, had provided Seba with a chain of addresses at the end of which this cache had survived, unopened, for 3/4 of a century. These letters are distinct from the correspondence Michael Bloch edited and published in 1986. Bloch's edition, Wallis and Edward, Letters, 1931 to 1937, drew primarily on correspondence between Wallis and Edward, and between Wallis and her aunt, Bessie Merriman. Bloch's edition already showed something important. The Chicago Tribune's 1986 review described letters that subtly undermine the Windsor's own claim to a simple fairy tale romance and show her trying to avert the abdication, rather than eagerly pushing Edward to sacrifice his throne. The letters in Bloch's edition included an October 1936 letter, in which Wallis asked Edward whether it wouldn't be better for her to quietly slip away. A letter written 5 days before the abdication, expressing sorrow that he intended to abdicate, fearing people would say she could have prevented it, and a proposal to postpone wedding plans by 8 months to allow Edward to remain king. Bloch's own editorial conclusion was that Edward had been determined to follow her wherever she went and would never let her go. The Seba letters, addressed to Ernest, go further than Bloch's edition reached. On the 30th of November 1936, the same evening Crystal Palace burned in South London, Wallis wrote to Ernest about her determination to escape England, perhaps forever. She knew she would need to deceive the king about her departure, planning to tell him she was searching for hats. The reason she needed to deceive him, according to this letter, he had threatened to take his own life if she left. That specific claim, the suicide threat, is reported through Wallis's own correspondence and corroborated across multiple biographies by Seba, Andrew Morton, and Donald Spotto. Time magazine, summarizing Seba's research, framed it as occurring by some accounts. There is no verbatim primary document from Edward in which the threat appears in his own words, but the emotional dynamic the letters describe is consistent. She was trying to leave, and she felt she couldn't because his survival had been placed on her conscience. She described herself as trapped in a prison. She apologized to Ernest for not buying him a Christmas present because she couldn't emerge from the villa. She criticized Mary Kirk, by then Ernest's companion, soon to be his next wife, and wrote that the wound of Mary's presence in Ernest's life was one that would never heal. And she wrote directly, in one letter, "Oh, my very dear, dear Ernest, I can only cry as I say farewell and press your hand very tightly and pray to God." In another, "Wherever you are, you can be sure that never a day goes by without some hour's thought of you and for you, and again in my prayers at night. With love, Wallis." In the letters written after she had married Edward, from the honeymoon, from their years in France, she wrote to Ernest, "I think of us so much, though I try not to." She described the dual side of her nature, writing that, "You filled my one side so utterly." She wrote to him from Germany during the October 1937 visit. She used, in her letters to Ernest, the same private term of endearment, Enum, that she and Edward used in their own correspondence. Both Wallis and Ernest, in these letters, referred to Edward privately as Peter Pan. Seba observes, "The fact that Wallis used it to Ernest, along with the reference between them to the king as Peter Pan, indicates that Wallis and Ernest discussed and privately ridiculed the king's childish behavior. There is also this, from a letter written as the crisis was at its worst. "Wasn't life lovely, sweet, and simple? I can't believe that such a thing could have happened to two people who got along so well. At least it never should have been like it's now." The man who abdicated an empire was privately mocked as Peter Pan in intimate correspondence. The woman who supposedly engineered his downfall wrote, "Give me courage," to the man she was supposed to have discarded. How to read all of this depends, in part, on what you want the letters to prove. Seba's reading, the dominant interpretation among modern biographers, is that the letters demonstrate genuine attachment to Ernest that outlasted the marriage, and a corresponding wish to have escaped Edward that the abdication made permanently impossible. Wallis had offered to withdraw and been refused the option. The letters express a deeper kind of contentment, as Seba writes, that she recognized too late had been Ernest, not Edward. Her future would be with a demanding and willful ex-king in exile, and plenty of jewelry. She was making the best of it. The alternative reading, which other biographers have proposed, is that the letters express guilt and emotional management as much as genuine longing. Wallis was a woman who handled difficult men through correspondence. The tender letters to Ernest are consistent with her social style, regardless of their emotional authenticity. The same documents, this reading argues, show ambivalence rather than a clean verdict. Both readings are honest. The letters don't eliminate ambiguity. What they eliminate is the huntress myth. Whatever Wallis Simpson felt in November and December of 1936, she wasn't feeling triumphant. By naming her as the reason for his abdication, and including one sentence acknowledging that she had tried to prevent it, in a sentence no one heard, Edward had arranged things so that the sympathy flowed to him and the blame settled on her. The documents he created in private told one story. The broadcast he delivered in public told another. Only one of those stories had 40 million listeners. At 22:01 on the evening of the 11th of December 1936, the BBC interrupted the regular comic opera broadcast. Sir John Reith introduced His Royal Highness Prince Edward. Edward sat at a microphone at Windsor Castle, knocked his leg against the table, the sound picked up by the equipment, and began. The speech he delivered had been through multiple drafts. Walter Monckton, his principal legal advisor throughout the crisis, was closely involved in drafting the core text with Edward. Winston Churchill, then a conservative backbencher, Edward's most vocal parliamentary ally, contributed to polishing the final wording. Churchill's own full alternative draft, which proposed that Edward might leave temporarily and return if public opinion shifted in his favor, had been vetoed by Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin as constitutionally impermissible. What the audience heard was the version Baldwin had allowed. "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." He also said, "The other person most nearly concerned has tried up to the last to persuade me to take a different course." The first sentence became one of the most quoted declarations of the 20th century. The second received almost no attention in the coverage that followed. The distance between them is the distance between the story that was told and the story that was true. 3 weeks earlier, Edward had spent several weeks pursuing a morganatic marriage, a legal arrangement under which Wallis would be his wife, but not queen consort. He had been backed by Churchill and Lord Beaverbrook. The cabinet and the Dominion governments rejected it. The abdication wasn't Edward's first choice. It was the fallback, arrived at only after every other option had closed. The romantic sacrifice that tens of millions heard on the 11th of December was the residue of a political failure. At Louviers, Herman Rogers had been acting as Wallis's press intermediary during the day and sleeping in the adjacent room with a loaded revolver at night because the threatening mail, including bomb warnings, had become serious enough to constitute a real security concern. When the broadcast ended, those present left Wallis on the sofa. She lay there, in the dark, with her hands over her eyes, unable to move. Sir John Reith, walking home after the broadcast, wrote in his diary, "What that young man has thrown away, the greatest opportunity that any king or any man ever had." I felt sorry for him. The decree absolute was granted on the 3rd of May, 1937. On the 27th of May, 1 week before the wedding, George VI issued letters patent confirming the HRH style for the Duke of Windsor, while explicitly excluding his wife and descendants from that style. Edward learned of it from a letter from his brother with, in his own words, "not very good news." His comment, "This is a nice wedding present." The decision required legal contrivance. Under British common law, a wife takes her husband's rank automatically. To prevent Wallis from becoming a royal highness, George VI declared that Edward had lost all royal rank upon abdicating, itself legally dubious, since the relevant letter's patent had never been formally revoked, and restored it as a conditional grant that applied to the Duke alone. The condition was the one that mattered. The insistence came from Queen Mary and the new Queen Elizabeth, both of whom refused to receive Wallis, and both of whom made their position known before the wedding. Queen Mary held that position without modification until her death in March 1953. The wedding took place on the 3rd of June 1937 at Château de Condé, a Loire Valley property owned by Charles Badeau, the same industrialist who had arranged the Germany visit that autumn. The civil ceremony was at 11:42 in the morning in the library, presided over by the mayor of Mons. A religious service followed, conducted by the Reverend Robert Anderson Jardine, vicar of St. Paul's in Darlington, who proceeded, despite an explicit warning from the Bishop of Durham that he had no episcopal license for the ceremony. Jardine's willingness to proceed cost him his career. Approximately 20 guests were present. Herman Rogers walked Wallis down the aisle. Not one member of the British royal family attended. The tombstones at Frogmore, where both Windsors are buried, state what the palace decision finally settled. His reads, HRH, the Prince Edward Albert, Christian George Andrew Patrick David, Duke of Windsor. Hers reads, Wallis, Duchess of Windsor. The distinction insisted upon in life is inscribed in stone. In October 1937, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor toured Nazi Germany. The visit was arranged by Charles Badeau, whose motivations were practical. He needed to strengthen his own business relationships with the Nazi regime, which had been making his operations in Germany increasingly difficult. He contacted Hitler's adjutant, Fritz Wiedemann, who confirmed the Führer would receive them. The official stated purpose was a study of German labor conditions and worker housing, framing Edward's genuine long-standing interest in working-class welfare. They met high-ranking Nazi officials throughout the tour, and they had tea with Adolf Hitler at the Berghof. The Hitler meeting is documented in multiple named secondary sources. The FBI maintained a surveillance file on the Duke and Duchess, monitoring their German-connected associations. Claims that have accumulated around this visit concerning alleged intelligence passed to German contacts and Hitler's alleged intentions for Edward in the event of a successful invasion of Britain are documented in the record as allegations and are presented here as nothing more. What isn't allegation is the reputational consequence for Wallis, his political decisions, her public image. That pattern, established at the abdication broadcast, confirmed at the wedding with the HRH denial, extended at every point where his choices and her name diverged, held for 35 years. They settled eventually at the Villa Windsor on the Route du Champ d'Entraînement in the Bois de Boulogne, in the 16th arrondissement of Paris, leased from the City of France at a nominal rent. Edward died on the 28th of May 1972 of throat cancer, aged 77. Wallis, by then suffering from arteriosclerosis, flew to England for the funeral at St. George's Chapel. She sat beside Queen Elizabeth II during the service. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, who had never forgiven the abdication for the burden it placed on her husband's health and his shortened life, was present in the same chapel. Wallis spent the next 14 years in the Bois de Boulogne house. Her health deteriorated progressively. She lost the ability to speak around 1980 and became bedridden. The financial anxieties of those final years are documented. She died on the 24th of April, 1986, aged 89. Her funeral was held 4 days later at St. George's Chapel, April 29, 1986. Michael Bloch published Wallis and Edward, Letters, 1931 to 1937, the same year she died, the product of 6 years of access to the Windsor Archive in Paris. The New York Times, reviewing it on publication, noted that the letters showed her trying to avert the abdication rather than eagerly pushing Edward toward it. She had not lived to see the reception. She had not lived to be questioned. Anne Seba found the 15 letters to Ernest in 2011 in a private home, in the course of an interview she had almost not made. The son Ernest had with Mary Kirk, who had never known Wallis, to whom her name was almost absent from his father's household, had provided Seba with a chain of addresses. At the end of that chain was a packet of blue letters tied with ribbon, still in their original postmarked envelopes, folded by the same hands that had folded them in 1936. 75 years had passed since Wallis wrote them. The postmarks were still legible. She listened to the broadcast once, in a borrowed villa, and then she lived inside it for 35 more years. The palace called her a schemer because the alternative was admitting that their king had been a man who wouldn't take no for an answer. The press called it a love story because love stories sell. And Wallis Simpson, who had offered to disappear and been refused permission, paid for both versions, with her name, her husband, and every door that closed behind her on the way to the Bois de Boulogne. The letters she could never send while she lived are the verdict she finally delivered after death. The love story was the lie. The sentence was real. If you want more stories where the documents say something different from the myth, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it means we can keep making them.